Workplace burnout is estimated to cost the U.S. economy more than $300 billion a year. This is due to lost productivity, disengagement, employee turnover, as well as lower organizational commitment and absenteeism. In previous episodes, we've talked about the fact that burnout is often the result of compounded workplace stress and things like unclear expectations, chaotic environments, poor communication, too much work and too little appreciation, micromanagement, and lack of support. So today we're going to take a look at burnout from a leadership and management perspective. More specifically, we're going to talk about how we can identify burnout symptoms in our colleagues and team members before they become a problem. Hey everyone, my name is Rochelle.
And I'm Jeff.
And this is Burnout Banter. Before we get started, remember to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. So, Jeff, I wanted to open this up with a question to you on whether you have ever seen burnout among your team members or as a manager noticed it in your team, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, I think I've definitely seen it. I don't know if at the time I would have classified it as burnout.
Fair.
Because I know a lot more about burnout now than I used to, thanks to doing this podcast.
That's what we're here for.
But yeah, I definitely have. I think what I've done about it, I guess I've really tried to understand where people are coming from. And I think the more I've learned about it, the more I've tried to get to know the person and what could be happening in their life, what's leading them down the path of feeling burned out. Maybe they're striving for somebody else's definition of success and not theirs, or things like that might be creating the symptoms or the stuff that's causing the burnout in their life, stress, things like that.
You have taken a very empathetic approach, even without knowing what burnout was. I was trying to rack my brains and go back to my past lives working on a team. I wasn't a manager, but I've managed a team of one, so that didn't really count. But when I worked in bigger teams and looking at, say what?
It counts.
Thank you. I didn't consider myself a very good manager, so I pretend it didn't happen. Doesn't count. But when I was on bigger teams.
Can I point something out though?
Yes.
You managed the delivery of a proposal, which requires a ton of management and leadership, even if you're not leading other people directly. I'm just saying.
That is a fair point. And thank you for pointing out that I did that thing that proposal people do, where I just kind of dismissed all the things that I do because it's just my job. Now you've got me thinking, I was only specifically thinking of marketing and proposal team members that I've seen burnt out, and now I'm thinking back on the engineers and the architects that I've worked with, and I can definitely, thinking back now, see the burnout symptoms in a lot of the architects specifically that I've worked with, who are juggling so many projects, and engineers I work with now, some of my clients who are so stressed when they can't make their deadlines for me for proposals. And I can see the onset of burnout, and I try to do everything I can now to alleviate that. I offer to help in any way I can. I have every trick possible to get content out of them and get content into my hands with as little effort as possible on their part. But way, way back before I knew what burnout really was, when I was burnt out and had no idea, and seeing it in my team members, it often manifested as emotional outbursts, or just I remember watching one of my team members just sit on Facebook for literal hours at her desk. And I was like, how can you get away with that? And I was upset because her work gets passed to me when she doesn't finish it, because I was reliable. quote unquote. Nobody can see me doing that, but air quotes. And I'm wondering now, looking back, like how burnt out was she that she just did not care about anything else at work, that she just had on her work computer in an open office setting, her personal Facebook.
Yeah, she was totally shut down.
Totally shut down, didn't care if she got fired, if she got written up or anything.
Probably would have preferred it.
Probably. And I thought about like the warning signs that I maybe missed on the way up. And I was, we were both just little proposal coordinators, so it wasn't my job to help her out. But I could have been more supportive if I hadn't also been burned out. So that kind of got me thinking on this episode was, how do we recognize the burnout in our colleagues, and why is it so important? And
Well, I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've got hours of anecdata. Anybody who listens to the podcast knows that Jeff is the hard research part of this duo, and Rochelle is the in the trenches, this is how I feel, this is what I've seen part of the duo. But I tried to look at like the statistics. That's where we got, this $300 billion cost. I read a statistic recently that burnt out employees cost their employers 34% of their annual salary. And that's from like healthcare costs, absenteeism, things getting passed off, projects not being in budget because of the cynicism and the lack of effort being put into your projects. So like there's an actual tangible cost to this. And I think that's those dollar signs are what we need to throw at management and leadership to get them to recognize that burnout is such an issue in their organizations.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? So I'm thinking back to the time when I've managed the most people, and it was 40 people. And I was burned out while doing that. So you asked me,
oh no,
as a manager, as a leader, what did you do to help people that were burned out? And I think me being burned out it made it much harder for me to care that my employees were potentially burned out too. So I think that's a huge part of, when we talk about management or leadership's role in burnout is, do they address their burnout first? Or, can you do both at the same time?
I don't think you can. I hate using this example, but I don't know, it works really well. It's the oxygen mask, right? The plane's crashing, you have to put on your mask before you can help the people next to you, or you're no good to anybody. And I think you have to at least, maybe not completely solve your burnout, but I think you have to create space for yourself to start and figure out what you need to reverse your burnout in order to be able to help your employees. Because if you're struggling and you're trying to help them, then you're taking on the emotional burden of their burnout on top of yours. And like we talked about a few episodes back, that emotional burden spins you into this vicious cycle. And also you isolate, like we talked about a few episodes back, you tend to isolate when you're burnt out. You can't be there for your team members if you are burned out and isolating and need to withdraw to protect yourself. So
Yeah,
that's tough.
I think because I do tend to be more empathetic. I almost handled that in the other way, where I was prioritizing their well-being over my own until it got to the point that broke.
Right. I think it's a Band-Aid. It'll work for a little bit. You'll be able to help them for a little bit. And then when you snap, what happens to the other 39 people on your team?
I think we've talked about the example with my wife where I spent, she was needing something, or the kids were needing something when I got home. And my response after a full day of taking care of people, or a full week of taking care of people at work, was, I don't have any energy to care about more things, right? Like all I do all day is care about these 40 people, and I don't have anything left. And that was where I was at, right? Like that was the breaking point. I
Right.
wasn't giving anything to myself. I was giving it to everybody else, and that doesn't work.
No, no. And you can't. So I think to combat burnout, and we talk about doing it from a top-down perspective because leadership has the power, right? We have to create this like supportive and empathetic work environment. And you can't do that if you are also seeking support and empathy, right? Like if you can't find it, how are you going to create it for your team? So
Right.
maybe that means you need to go above. And if you're struggling with your own burnout, you might not have the tools to identify the signs of burnout in your colleagues early enough to intervene and provide support. Like you'll probably notice it when it's too late. This is usually when our employees get put on like a, a performance improvement plan, which is essentially a corporate death sentence,
Or
right?
they
Or they leave. It's too late. By the time someone is totally absent, has started scrolling Facebook 8 hours a day, and is just begging you to fire them, like there's literally nothing you can do. So, what are some things that you think we can look out for as managers? You know, assuming that we are not burnt out and we have handled our burnout and are looking to create a culture of empathy. What should we be looking for in our teams, our colleagues, our partners, even our leadership? Like maybe we need to also look up and make sure that they're okay so that we can then top down create that culture of a empathetic and supportive work environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go back to the definition of burnout that we talked about last time, right? It's exhaustion. What some signs that they're exhausted. Maybe yawning.
Oh no, I yawn all the time. I'm also apparently
I think we
always burnt
established
out.
last time that you were exhausted as well. So, not feeling effective at what they're doing, right? So maybe they're complaining about their ability to get their job done, blaming
Mhm.
other people for why they can't get their job done. And then I guess with the disengagement, the cynicism, um, I know when I've been burned out, if somebody was looking for what to look for, it would have been that I wasn't executing my job.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And I didn't really seem to care. So that would be something else, right? If somebody's starting to miss things or not be doing as good of a job, maybe they're in that place, right, where they're potentially feeling burnout. Especially if in the past they were a high performer, right? Maybe if somebody never was,
It's hard to notice.
it's hard to notice, right? But if somebody was a high performer and now they're not, that's probably a good indicator that something's going on.
Yeah, those behavioral changes are super important. And I think, you know, a lot of companies have like annual performance reviews, and it's all about productivity and commitment to the company. And maybe it needs to be less about that and more about, you know, we've noticed that this is kind of your work style. This is like maybe there needs to be a less quantitative component to that, where it's a good opportunity to check in on this is how you've been functioning in your role. And we've noticed over the last year, you've changed how you've functioned in your role. Like you've started missing QA/QC checks, or you are no longer engaging in weekly team meetings, or you seem to always have a reason to not be in them. You haven't come to a single employee like appreciation event. Like I think we tend to write a lot of that stuff off, especially with I'm going to anecdata here, high functioning burnouts and introverts. It's really, really hard to spot burnout in introverts as a manager, I think, because they tend to keep to themselves. And that's where that kind of emotional outbursting starts to happen.
Yeah.
And because we are often also stressed out ourselves, we just don't have the patience or the empathy to deal with that. But that's a huge indicator that your fellow introvert team member is stressed if they start emotional outbursting.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it does, I think ultimately it comes down to behavior change, right? If somebody was this way and now they're a different way, something's going on, right? If they did attend company events and now they're not,
Right.
something's going on. I'm going to throw myself under the bus here. In leadership meetings, I would typically be pretty engaged, but at the point when I was burned out and we would have leadership meetings, I wanted nothing to do with it and would intentionally not interact and I would try to find like ways to like meditate or do something where it just like would pass the time. I was that out of what was going on. I'm sure people noticed, but again, did anybody say anything? No, right?
Probably
It's that
not.
behavioral change that you're looking for ultimately.
I tried to schedule proposal printing during mandatory town hall meetings. So like everybody would flood into the lobby and I'd be like, oh, sorry, this is due tomorrow. I got to go print it. And I just go hide in the printing room and work on my proposal with my headphones in because I just could not deal. And part of that is my introversion. Being around people is exhausting. But part of it was that was just another thing that I didn't feel like I needed to be a part of. I didn't want to be a part of. I didn't care about. And that hour alone in the print room by myself was like a little bitty recharge for me, which should have been a huge red flag for myself, but it wasn't. My manager didn't notice either. They just chalked that up to Rochelle being weird. So, you know,
I'll try not to touch that one, but
thank you.
even right, like for an introvert, if they're engaged in what's going on and engaged in the company, they will participate in things. It's just going to be tiring for them, right?
Yes. Or they might show their engagement in different ways. Like I remember helping with planning for some of the stuff or like designing posters for some of the employee appreciation stuff. I had a blast with all of that. It was just the actual attending that was exhausting to me, but all the support stuff was great and creative. And when I stopped doing that, should have been an indicator to anybody who was paying attention, but nobody was, or nobody knew to pay attention. This was 10 years ago. So,
And I think the other trap that we can fall into is writing that off as they're just busy.
That's huge for proposal people. They're just
It's
busy.
okay. They're just busy. That's why they're doing this, or they're just busy. That's why their quality's dropped off a little bit, right? And so I think we can excuse the behavior and potentially miss the burnout by putting that, I'm using the air quotes now, busy tag on somebody's behavior.
It absolutely happens. We were talking about non-compliance this week in one of my other roles, one of my other lives, and a lot of them were like uncharacteristic mistakes for a lot of proposal people. Most people that we were talking to have gone 15 years with maybe 3 non-compliant proposals ever, and all of a sudden they have 2 in the same year, and that's a sign of burnout when you start making these uncharacteristic mistakes and overlooking important details, routine tasks. Like you start to autopilot those as much as possible because it's your routine, you're burnt out, you're just skating through, you're just surviving. And that's where we tend to make the most mistakes when we're burnt out. And that's a big sign for managers to look out for. Like, you forgot to update the date on the cover of this proposal. It says maybe it's the template default, like February 12th, 2018. That's something that a non-burned out person would probably catch pretty quickly, or would catch after a couple of drafts. But if they're not, it means maybe they're not paying quite the attention that they need to. And it's not something to reprimand them for, it's something to check in with them about. But I feel like we often jump straight to, you made a mistake, we need to put a process in place here for making sure it never happens again. That's my manager voice.
That's a good engineering one too. Over process the non-performance, and instead of dealing with what the real issue is, we'll just make a process.
It's a proposal thing too.
Yeah.
We missed a form. Now we have 6 people who need to double check that form, sign off on that form, refill out the form just to make sure it was done correctly the first time. It's like, that's not the solution. Uh, so how do we support a burnout colleague, right? We are listening to this podcast, so we are very well educated on what burnout is, what it looks like. We even know the sneaky burnout symptoms. So how do we approach someone that we are pretty certain is probably burnt out?
Well, I guess the first thing I would do is I would frame that from my perspective.
I statement.
I wouldn't say you're burned out, because they're going to be like, oh, and get defensive about it. So I'm noticing these things happening. Is there something going on that I should be aware of as your manager leader to help you through, or even to just be aware of so that I know that you're dealing with this thing that's happening and can factor that into my assessment of your work. We had a guy whose girlfriend broke up with him, like they were together for a long time, and and it did affect his work performance. Now, if we didn't know that, we'd just be like, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he doing this? But it's different knowing that, he's got this thing that he's dealing with, and we can cut him some slack potentially as he works his way through that.
I think an important thing said but unsaid there is creating a culture where you are comfortable enough and have the confidence in your management to share sensitive and private information like that as it relates to your job performance. We don't need to be gossiping or spilling everything, but I very rarely run into an in-house role where I would have been comfortable enough going to a manager and saying, hey, I'm having this huge personal life issue. Can you just bear with me while I work through it? Bearing in mind, these roles that I've had in the past have just been brutal, and I don't think they're totally normal. But I think creating that culture of empathy and trust is super important to allowing that communication between you and your team members and your colleagues, and especially the colleagues that maybe you're not as close to outside of work. They'll talk to you about stuff like that. That's fine. But the colleague who just shows up, goes home, and that's the only time you see them, that's the only time you interact, it's harder for them to bring in their humanness to work, because a lot of times humanness is not allowed in work. We're just supposed to function. We're just supposed to be little machines, productivity machines. So
that is, I think, a very old school way of how to lead and how to look at a company as like a machine that just churns out a product or something. But I do think, as we step into this century and, there is more empathetic leadership, more women leaders in the workplace, I think that is helping with some of that discussion that needs to take place, right? And I can't, if I've never had a conversation with this person, he's not going to tell me that he just broke up with his girlfriend, right? We've had to build a rapport that we talk about things that are personal as his manager outside of, just what are you doing at work, for him to feel comfortable having that conversation with me in the first place.
Right. Once again, Jeff being positive and Rochelle being cynical. Summary of the podcast. But I think as a manager, because you have to be able to connect with both the team members that you have built that trust and relationship with, and the ones that you haven't, if you're going to talk about burnout. And so maybe keeping in mind that these need to be private conversations. Maybe they need to not happen in front of leadership or a performance improvement board. Making sure that they know we're listening without judgment and we are just there to support them. And it might take multiple conversations to get to that point. Like Jeff said, we might need to build that up once we see it. And so we just need to make sure we are being as empathetic as possible and respectful of our colleagues' privacy and letting them come to us when they need to, and just doing what we can to ease their burden until they're ready to either talk to us or, take up their role in full again.
Yeah, and I would argue you need to start the conversation well before they're at a point of burnout too, right? You're building the rapport the whole time they work with you or for you,
Right.
so that you can have these tougher conversations if you need to have them. And some people are going to be open to it and are really going to engage, and some people aren't, and that's okay too. But I think the fact that I try, at least they know that I care.
Right.
And if they know that I care, then we can have a conversation if everything's not okay with them. Whether they're willing to completely open up or not, that's fine too. Even if I don't know what's going on, I just know something's going on. That's different than me just assuming that they're just slacking off at work.
Yeah, this is just how they are.
Yeah.
They're no longer committed to the company, so we don't care about them. But yeah, culture is built over time, not when you need it to be or when it's convenient to be. So something to keep in mind.
I think as a manager or a leader, right? If your company doesn't have that type of culture, you can look at that and just be like, okay, well, this isn't how this company is, or I'm going to try to change it. And, everybody may not buy in, but this is how I'm going to act, because this is what is going to make me feel good. This is what I think is the best way to go about this. And, maybe it'll have a positive impact on everybody else, or maybe it won't, but I guarantee it will on your team.
Emotions go both ways. Negative emotions infect the team. Positive emotions also positively infect the team. Like,
Yeah.
It's just how humans work. I don't know the science behind that, but it's how humans work.
Yeah, and I think we do get wrapped up in, right, we have to be productive with our time, and having a 30-minute conversation about soccer or golf or whatever or is going on that somebody enjoys, we see that as not productive when it really is.
Yes, we talk about this often, how taking care of yourself, self-care, is productive for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be productive for the bottom line of anything. Like we have to nourish all of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Mind, body, soul, checkbook, all that stuff. But I feel like we put so much effort into checkbook and status that we forget about body, mind, and soul, if you believe that.
Yeah. And another thing that happens, I was just listening to some stuff last week. We get promoted into management or leadership positions a lot of times because we're effective producers. And so because we're in this new role that is unfamiliar, we tend to revert back to being producers. And we forget that a huge part of our role is the people, right? That we're now leading or managing, and trying to get the most out of them and make sure they're happy and fulfilled with what they're doing. And so I think at times, it's really easy to revert back to, well, I was really good at this. This makes me super uncomfortable. So I'm just going to ignore this thing that makes me super uncomfortable and do the thing that I was really good at in the first place. And that's an easy trap to fall into. But as a manager leader, the people are the most important part of what you're doing every day.
And it's okay to admit that you are afraid of being a leader. It's okay to admit that maybe you're not great at it and figure out how to be better at it, or figure out a different role. I feel like we often move up because we are expected to move up, and management and leadership tends to be up. There are very few roles where you just continue producing on your own at the top of the food chain. And so seeking help from that's also creating a culture of support and empathy by asking for it for yourself, which helps you solve your burnout, and in turn lets you help the rest of your team combat stress and burnout.
Yeah, but I think what you mentioned about a private conversation is super important. It could be important to get them away from work, right? Like, let's go for a walk. Because even if they're in work, right, like being called into the boss's office, everybody else is like, what's going on in there? Right. So,
and you're instantly defensive because you're like, what did I do? And if you're burnt out, your extra stress or your anxiety brain is going through all of the things that you might have messed up. Like, yeah, not a good.
so getting away from the office to have this conversation, going to lunch, something like that, right? Where you're out of just normal office place environment.
Right.
Helpful.
A little more casual, comfortable.
And I think the other thing, I think sometimes we put pressure on ourselves as managers or leaders to have the answers. And you don't have to have the answer for them. You just have to recognize that somebody's struggling and be willing to get them help from somebody who does. If you don't, right? Like, we may not be equipped to deal with whatever this person's experiencing, but somebody is. And as long as we support them in getting that help from that somebody, that's being supportive too.
Exactly. Management and leadership does not have to have all the answers. I feel like we are pressured to have all of the answers when you get to higher and higher positions. But the most effective leaders understand their limitations and look for solutions from experts around them. Exactly. I cannot yell that loud enough, that point, to underscore it. We'll just rewind and play that over and over for the next 15 minutes. That's your message from today's Burnout Banter.
Yeah. And I think too, right? Hey, I may not be in a place where I'm able to deal with this as a manager or leader, whether I'm burned out or I have other stuff going on in my life, but I see that you're having a problem and let me get you help, even if it's not coming from me, because I just can't do it right now.
Exactly. Want to be cognizant of time because, it's what good leaders and managers do. Do we have any other thoughts before we move on to our burning question?
No, and I guess the only last thing I would say, right, is if you've brought it up and somebody's not comfortable sharing, right, we can't force the issue either. So, just let them know you're there for them. And if they do want to talk, they can. But if they don't, that's fine too. And, it's important that we don't try to push beyond where somebody's comfortable sharing.
Right. Absolutely. We can only offer empathy, support, encouragement, and they take it or they don't.
Yep. But you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right?
You said it. I was thinking it, but I wasn't going to say it.
Now it's time for burning questions.
So our burning question says, hi, Jeff and Rochelle. I'm the regional marketing manager for an engineering firm and oversee a team of 10 to 15 proposal and marketing staff. We've been struggling with turnover for the past few years, and I know part of this is because workloads can get stressful when we're trying to fill empty spots on the team or train up a new employee. To HR and leadership, we're doing fine because we're still winning work. Oof, ouch. I guess my question is, how can I talk to my team about burnout and stress? And how can I talk to HR and leadership about managing it more effectively? Excellent question.
I think with the staff, especially if you're working to replace people, I always try to communicate what I'm doing to resolve the situation, that I know that their workload is too high, that this is a temporary situation, hopefully, or we're trying to make it as temporary of a situation as possible. And just offer extra support while they're experiencing this, if they need it. And also emphasizing that we're a team, right? So all the burden doesn't fall on one person or the other, right? Like, can we balance this overload together in a way that tries to minimize the impact on people as much as possible?
I agree. My concern with this question is that the turnover is so high. Usually in a proposal capacity, that means that there is something else going on. So the burnout isn't necessarily, or the stress is not necessarily happening only because we're trying to staff. It is probably coming from other sources, so process or people related. which means that we might need to be looking at what winning work, using those air quotes again, actually means for the company. Because you could be winning work, but leadership might only be looking at the pursuits that they are aware of, top of mind of, the big ones, and not fully understanding all of the other things that you do, especially in AEC marketing. We're not just proposal people. We're running conferences, we're running your newsletters, we're running your social media. We help with HR, recruiting, hiring, like literally anybody needs anything designed, written, communicated, that goes through your proposal team for whatever reason in a lot of companies. And so I'm wondering if there needs to be a broader conversation between the marketing management and HR and leadership about the processes that are happening around proposals and marketing, the expectations of individuals, because it, to me, very much sounds like everybody is burdened, even when you're at full capacity. So even if you have 15 people, I'm fairly certain, I'm going to speculate here, that those 15 people are still overworked.
Yeah, and I think when there is high turnover, something that you can look at is you're going to get a very logical reason for why people have left. That is not the reason why they're leaving. So you can accept the logical reason and say, oh, well, somebody's paying more. That's, there's nothing we can do about that. There is another reason that is leading them to leave. And their coworkers who are still there may know what that real reason is, or they may be experiencing the real reason, right? So can you, if you're comfortable enough as a leader, or they're comfortable enough as your employees, have an open conversation about what's going on. Because a lot of times people just want to be heard too, right? And know that you've heard their concerns and they're trying to do something about it. Brainstorming session on how things can be made better, or, what's causing people to leave or something like that.
Yes. Example that comes to mind, I don't know if I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I know I've talked about it. I worked with a client, engineering client, and the marketing manager was having a really hard time talking to leadership about staffing and why she thought they needed at least 3 other people just based on the workload that she was seeing, and they wanted data. And so she went into their, I think they were using Deltek. She went into like their whatever time management system was to pull hours and see how much people were working, and was shocked to find out that the tracking system stopped recording after 40 hours. So none of the proposal team or the marketing team's additional hours worked during the week were being recorded. And that's how HR and leadership were justifying not hiring. So even though this woman called me and was like, had worked 70 hours and it was Friday morning and was practically in tears asking me to help her out, HR thought she'd only worked 40 hours that week and didn't see the need to supplement her team. And so it could be something invisible like that. I think that was an unfortunately drastic case. But if HR and leadership could have just sat down with the marketing team, they are all since gone. This has not been resolved, unfortunately. That entire marketing team has quit and left in the last year.
Resolved by everybody leaving?
It was resolved by everybody leaving. And they just wanted to be heard. And nobody would listen to them. So for all of my leaders listening to this podcast, please, please, please don't just dismiss because the data says you're good. Obviously, in this case, maybe it's an extreme case. It was incorrect.
Well, I also know there are engineers who I've worked with who will not put more than 40 hours in their timesheet, even if they're working them. So that could be happening as well, right? Where people, it's either encouraged that you don't put more time in your timesheet, or people make that assumption that it's a bad thing to show all these extra hours work because it gets charged to the project, or whatever the reason is, right? It's my projects will be more profitable if I don't put down all the time that I'm working. But people do it. And so that could be happening too.
Oh, my eyebrows are so far into my hairline. I just can't.
So, yeah. And I think, talking to HR and leadership about it, right? These are the things I'm seeing. Could we bring in some outside help? Could we have some conversations about it? They may or may not engage in that, but as the leader of these people, whether you get the result that you want to or not, I think going and having the conversation, even if it's tough, we owe it to the people we lead and manage to do that.
Agreed. And if for my bigger teams, if you're running into turnover like this, it might be time to bring in not just outside help, but maybe like an outside resource to help you assess, because there's something going on that maybe is making people not feel comfortable sharing, or they need more like an anonymous platform to share or a third party to go through. One of the companies I worked with did bring in an individual who sat down and did individual interviews with all of us. And I don't know what magic that individual had, but everybody spilled their guts to this woman and just aired out the entire company's, dirty laundry. But it was really effective because nobody felt like they could talk to leadership because leadership wasn't listening, but leadership listened to this random individual. I don't know what her qualifications were, but she had this whole report on, hey, you have some tensions here between these two departments and it's causing problems here, or there's friction between this group or these like actual individuals. And so a lot of things got really worked out. It was like a giant therapy session for the company.
It's like when my son fractured his heel. And
Ouch.
I could say, don't go outside and play basketball, let that heal. And do you think he listened to me?
Of course not.
No. When I got the doctor to say, if you don't stop playing basketball, I'm putting you in a boot for 6 weeks, do you think he stopped playing basketball? Yes, he did. So sometimes it's having that expert, even though I was saying the same exact thing, having a third party say the exact same thing or, whatever can sometimes make a difference.
Yeah, I think it removes the bias. I think there's just a perception if there's no bias if it's a third party person, but
yeah,
I don't know. Recommendation.
Plus as parents, we don't know what we're talking about anyways, because
how dare you care about his well-being and his future? You just don't want him to have fun.
yes, that's what it's all about.
Oh, that's funny. Any final thoughts on our burning question?
No.
I wish them well. That's my final thought. Good luck, regional marketing manager. Friendly reminder that if you have a burning question, you can email it to us. We anonymize the heck out of it and put it on air to answer for you. You can email that to us at burnoutbanter@gmail.com. And also, friendly reminder, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen: Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or anywhere else you can get podcasts.
All
We'll see you
right.
next time.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.